stood at the viewing window of the orbital station and watched Earth grow smaller. He did not feel sad. He did not feel much of anything anymore. The blue planet had been his home for 32 years, but now it was just another sphere of rock and water spinning in the darkness. He turned away and picked up his bag, a small thing that held everything he owned. A few clothes, his medical certification, and a photograph he could not bring himself to throw away. The transport ship was called the Wanderer, and thought the name was fitting. That was what he was now, a wanderer with no home and no purpose. He had purchased a one-way ticket to Six, the farthest human settlement accepting workers. He did not know anything about the place except that it was far from everyone who knew his name and far from the memories that haunted him every night. He found his seat in the common passenger area and sat down among the other travelers. Most of them looked like him, tired faces and empty eyes, people running from something. The frontier colonies attracted two kinds of people, those seeking fortune and those seeking escape, belonged to the second group. The ship hummed as the engines powered up and closed his eyes. He tried not to think, but the memories came anyway. They always did. It had been 9 months since the mission on Kestrel 4. 9 months since he had watched his entire squad die while he knelt in the mud with empty medical bags and useless hands. They had been ambushed in a canyon by hostile forces that intelligence said did not exist. 23 soldiers had entered that canyon, only had walked out. He remembered Sergeant Peters calling for a medic while blood poured from her stomach. He remembered Private screaming for his mother as his legs were torn apart by weapons fire. He remembered Lieutenant Davis ordering him to run, to survive, to tell command what had happened. Had run. He had survived. And now he lived with the guilt of being the only one who did. The military had given him a discharge and called him a hero. They said he had done everything possible, but knew the truth. He had not done enough. He had run out of supplies. He had made wrong choices under pressure. He had lived while better people died. A voice came over the speakers and announced that the ship was departing, opened his eyes and looked around at his fellow passengers. A young woman with a bruised face sat across from him. An old man with shaking hands sat near the window. A family with 2 small children huddled together in the corner. Everyone had a story. Everyone had a reason for leaving everything behind. The journey to Six took 3 weeks, spent most of it alone. He ate when he remembered to eat. He slept when his body forced him to sleep. He spoke to no one and no one spoke to him. The other passengers seemed to understand that some people needed to be left alone. On the final day, the transport captain came to the common area and gathered everyone together. He was a large man with kind eyes and a voice that carried without shouting. He told them about Six and what to expect. The planet was a frontier world, still being settled and developed. The main settlement was called Haven's Edge, and it was home to about 5,000 humans. But humans were not the only residents. Six was a joint settlement shared with a species called the. Listened as the captain described them. They were a feline-like species, tall and covered in short fur that ranged from gray to dark brown. They had evolved as hunters on a harsh world, and their culture revolved around the hunt and the pride, their family units. They were not enemies of humanity, but they were not exactly friends either. The two species tolerated each other and traded when it benefited both sides. The captain warned them to be respectful and to avoid direct eye contact with unless they knew them well. Starring was considered a challenge among their kind. He also mentioned that many on Six were outcasts from their own society, just like many of the humans who came to the frontier. Did not care about any of this. He just wanted a place to exist quietly until he stopped existing altogether. He was not planning to end his own life. He simply did not care if it continued. The ship landed at Haven's Edge in the late afternoon. The sky was orange and purple, painted by a sun slightly larger and redder than Earth's. The air was breathable but carried a sharp smell, like metal and pine mixed together. Stepped off the ship and felt gravity pull at him, slightly stronger than Earth normal. His body would adjust in time. The settlement spread out before him, a mix of prefabricated buildings and structures made from local materials. It looked rough and unfinished, like a place still figuring out what it wanted to be. Could appreciate that. He was still figuring out the same thing. He collected his small bag and walked toward the registration building where new arrivals checked in and received work assignments. The line was short, and he moved through it quickly. A tired clerk looked at his documents and raised an eyebrow at his medical certification. The clerk said they needed medical personnel badly. The settlement clinic was understaffed, and a trained combat medic was worth his weight in gold out here. Would start work tomorrow. He nodded and took the papers that assigned him quarters and told him where to report. He turned to leave and stopped. Near the entrance, a group stood watching the new arrivals. There were 4 of them, tall and lean, their eyes gleaming in the fading sunlight. Notice their faces and arms carried scars, pale lines against their fur that spoke of violence survived. One of them, a female with particularly deep scars across her face and left arm, met his gaze for a moment. Her eyes were yellow with vertical pupils, and they held something recognized. It was the same emptiness he saw in his own reflection. The look of someone who had lost everything and was still trying to understand why they remained. She turned away first and said something to her companions in a language that sounded like purring mixed with clicks. They moved off into the settlement, disappearing between buildings. Watched them go and felt the first flicker of something other than numbness. It was curiosity, small and weak but present. He wondered what had the Huntress so deeply, not just her body but her soul. He wondered if she too had come to this frontier world looking for escape. He shook his head and started walking toward his assigned quarters. It did not matter. He was not here to make connections or find meaning. He was here to disappear. That was all. But as he walked through the dusty streets of Haven's Edge, he could not shake the image of those yellow eyes from his mind. Eyes that looked just as broken as his own. The clinic was smaller than had expected. It was a single building with 4 examination rooms, a small surgery, and a storage area that never seemed to have enough supplies. He learned this on his first morning when doctors showed him around and explained how things worked on the frontier. Was a woman in her 50s with gray hair and steady hands. She had come to 6-8 years ago after losing her husband to cancer. She told this without emotion, simply stating facts. She understood why people came to places like this, and she did not ask him about his reasons. Was grateful for that. The work was constant but manageable. Frontier settlers came in with cuts, broken bones, infections, and the occasional gunshot wound from hunting accidents. Treated them all with quiet efficiency. His hands remembered what to do even when his mind tried to forget. He was a medic. Saving people was what he had been trained to do, even if he had failed when it mattered most. 2 weeks passed in this routine. Worked during the day and sat alone in his quarters at night. He did not make friends. He did not seek company. The other clinic staff learned quickly that he preferred silence and they respected his boundaries. Then she came. It was late afternoon when the clinic door burst open and the Huntress walked in. Recognized her immediately. Those yellow eyes and those deep scars were impossible to forget. She carried a young in her arms, a child no more than 8 or 9 years old by human reckoning. The child was unconscious and bleeding from a wound on his leg. The Huntress looked around the clinic with wild eyes until they landed on. She hissed, a sound that was both warning and desperation. Moved toward her slowly, his hands visible and open. He spoke in a calm voice and told her to put the child on the examination table. He said he could help but needed her to trust him. She hissed again when he reached for the child. Her claws extended slightly, catching the light. Did not step back. He had faced worse than an angry, he had faced himself. He kept his voice steady and explained what he was going to do. He said he needed to examine the wound and stop the bleeding. He said he would explain every step before he took it. He said the child would die if she did not let him work. Something in his words or his tone reached her. The huntress placed the child on the table and stepped back, her eyes never leaving his hands. Worked quickly but carefully. The wound was deep, a gash from something sharp that had cut into the muscle. It was not life-threatening if treated properly, but the child had lost blood and was going into shock. Cleaned the wound, applied pressure, and prepared for stitches. His hands trembled. They always trembled now when he worked on serious injuries, but they did not falter. He had learned to work through the shaking, to ignore the memories that tried to surface whenever he saw blood. The huntress watched everything he did. Her eyes tracked his movements with predatory attention, looking for any sign of threat or deception. She found none, was focused entirely on saving the child in front of him. An hour later, the young was stable, had stitched the wound, administered medication for pain and infection, and wrapped the leg in clean bandages. The child was sleeping now, his breathing steady and strong. Stepped back and finally looked at the huntress. Her posture had changed. The hostility was still there, but something else had joined it. Confusion perhaps, or curiosity. She spoke in accented but clear human language. She said her name was. She asked why his hands shook. Considered lying but decided against it. He said his hands had shaken since a bad mission 9 months ago. He said he could not make them stop, but he had learned to work anyway. Studied him for a long moment. Then she made a sound that could not interpret, something between a grunt and a purr. She said that human healers were strange. She said most beings would hide such weakness. Shrugged and said he did not see the point in hiding. Everyone was broken in some way. Some people just hid it better than others. His face twitched. It might have been surprise or amusement. She did not explain. Instead, she asked about the child. Was he truly safe now? Nodded and said the boy would need rest and careful treatment, but he would recover fully. He asked how had found him. She said she had been tracking in the wilderness and found the boy abandoned near a collapsed burrow. His family was gone, dead perhaps, or scattered by predators. She had brought him here because the healers would not treat an unknown child without family connections. Felt anger rise in his chest at that. He asked if her people truly let children die over such things. His eyes hardened. She said her people had many traditions and not all of them were kind. She said that was why she no longer belonged to any pride. She was an outcast, just like the humans who ran to the frontier. Before could respond, entered the room and stopped short at the sight of the huntress. The doctor looked at with raised eyebrows. Explained the situation briefly. Nodded and said the child could stay at the clinic until arrangements were made. She also said that Lisa from the settlement administration would need to be informed. Flinched slightly at the name. She said she knew Lisa and turned to leave. At the door, she paused and looked back at. She said she would return to check on the boy. Then she was gone, disappearing into the evening shadows. Came to stand beside and watched the empty doorway. She said that was a tragic figure. Once she had been a pride leader, one of the most respected huntresses on 6. Then a territorial war had claimed her entire hunting party. She was the only survivor. Understood immediately. He knew what it meant to be the only one who walked away. He knew the weight of that survival. Continued, saying that people viewed survivors with suspicion. They believed that someone who lived when others died must have done something wrong, had been cast out of society and now lived alone, working as a tracker and guide for anyone who would pay. Said nothing. He just stared at the doorway where had stood and thought about yellow eyes that held the same emptiness as his own. 3 days later, a distress signal came from Research Outpost 7. The facility was located 3 days into the wilderness, and something had gone wrong. They needed medical assistance immediately. Looked at with worry in her eyes. She said he was the only one who could go. She was too old for that kind of journey, and the other staff had no field experience. Felt fear curl in his stomach. The wilderness was dangerous. The journey was long. Everything about this situation reminded him of the mission that had broken him. But there were people who needed help, and was still a medic, no matter how shattered he felt inside. He said he would go. He just needed a guide who knew the terrain. Smiled sadly and said she knew exactly who to ask. Stood at the edge of the settlement and looked at with what he had learned to recognize as skepticism. Her ears were flat against her head, and her tail swished slowly behind her. She asked why she should guide a human who had never set foot in the wilderness of Six. She said it would be easier to go alone and faster too. Said he understood her hesitation, but the people at the outpost needed medical attention and was not trained for that. He said they would have to work together whether she liked it or not. Made a sound deep in her throat, something between a growl and a sigh. She said she would do it for payment, nothing more. The settlement had offered good credits for the job, and credits bought food and supplies. Nodded and said that was fine with him. He did not need her friendship. He just needed her skills. They departed at dawn the next morning. Carried a heavy pack filled with medical supplies, food, water, and emergency equipment. Carried almost nothing, just a hunting blade at her hip and a small pouch at her side. She moved through the terrain like water flowing over rocks, smooth and effortless. Struggled to keep up. The wilderness of Six was beautiful and deadly in equal measure. Towering trees with bark the color of rust stretched toward the orange sky. Strange plants with leaves that shimmered like metal grew in thick clusters along the ground. The air smelled of copper and something sweet that could not identify. Moved without speaking, her eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. Followed in silence, saving his breath for walking. The gravity was heavier than Earth, and his body was still adjusting. On the first night, they made camp in a small clearing surrounded by dense vegetation. Built a fire with practiced efficiency while set up their sleeping arrangements. When everything was ready, they sat on opposite sides of the fire and ate their rations without conversation. Finally broke the silence. He asked how long had lived on Six. She looked at him with narrowed eyes, clearly suspicious of the question, but she answered anyway. She said she had been born here. This was her world, her home, or it had been before she lost everything. Nodded slowly. He said he understood loss. He said that was why he had come to this place, to escape from memories he could not bear. His ears perked forward slightly, a sign of interest. She asked what memories haunted a human healer. Stared into the fire for a long moment. Then he told her. He told her about Kestrel 4 and the ambush in the canyon. He told her about the 23 soldiers who had trusted him to save them. He told her about running out of supplies and making wrong decisions and watching his friends die one by one while he could do nothing. He told her about being the only one who survived and the guilt that had eaten him alive ever since. When he finished, the fire crackled softly between them, said nothing for a while. Then she spoke in a quiet voice, softer than had ever heard from her. She said she too knew the weight of being the only survivor. She said that 3 years ago she had led her pride into a hunting ground that scouts had reported as safe. The information was wrong. Another pride had claimed that territory and ambushed them. 12 hunters had followed into that forest. None of them had come back except her. Asked how she had survived. His face twisted with old pain. She said she had fought harder and run faster than everyone else. She said sometimes she wondered if she had simply wanted to live more than they did, and that thought made her sick with shame. Understood perfectly. He had asked himself the same questions countless times. Why had he survived when better people died? What made him so special? The answer was nothing. He was not special. He was just lucky in the worst possible way. They sat in silence for a while longer, two broken souls sharing the warmth of a small fire in the darkness. Spoke again. She said her people believed that survivors carried bad spirits with them. They believed that someone who walked away from death must have been touched by it, marked by it. That was why they cast her out. They were afraid of what she might bring upon them. Said that was a cruel belief. He said no one chose to survive while others died. It just happened, and the survivors had to find a way to live with it. Looked at him with something new in her yellow eyes. It was not friendship exactly, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. The second day of travel was harder than the first. They crossed a river that ran cold and fast, then climbed a rocky slope that tested strength to its limits. Never complained or slowed down for him. She simply moved forward and expected him to follow. Gritted his teeth and followed. That night, they camped on a ridge overlooking a vast valley filled with glowing plants that cast blue light into the darkness. It was beautiful, but warned him that beauty on six often hid danger. The glowing plants attracted predators who used the light to hunt. They kept the fire small and took turns watching through the night. Near dawn, heard movement in the darkness beyond their camp. He woke with a touch, and she came alert instantly, her claws extending as she rose to a crouch. The creatures came from 3 directions at once. They were low and fast, like wolves made of shadow and teeth. Counted 6 of them before they attacked. Moved like lightning, her blade flashing in the dim light. She killed 2 of them in the first moments of the fight. Drew his own knife and stood back to back with her, defending against the creatures that tried to circle around. One of them got through his guard and sank its teeth into his arm, cried out but did not fall. He stabbed downward and felt the blade find flesh. The creature released him and collapsed. Another one leaped at from behind while she was fighting 2 others. Saw it coming and threw himself in its path. They tumbled together across the ground and felt teeth tear at his shoulder before he managed to get his knife into the creature's throat. Then it was over. 6 bodies lay scattered around their camp, and both were bleeding but alive. Stared at with wide eyes. She asked why he had done that. She asked why he had risked himself to save her. Looked at his wounded arm and shoulder. The bites were painful but not deep. He would survive. He said he was a medic. Protecting people was what he did. He said it did not matter if that person was human or a life was a life. Made a sound he had never heard before, something like a whimper mixed with a purr. She said she did not understand humans. She said her own people would have let her die to save themselves. Shook his head. He said not all humans were good and not all were bad. People were complicated, regardless of species. What mattered was the choices they made when things got hard. He sat down heavily and began treating his wounds. Watched for a moment, then moved to help him. Her clawed hands were surprisingly gentle as she cleaned the bite on his shoulder. She said she was starting to think she had misjudged him. She said perhaps humans were more interesting than she had believed. Almost smiled. It was the closest thing to a compliment he had received in a long time. They rested for a few hours, then continued their journey. The outpost was close now, just half a day ahead. Pushed through the pain and exhaustion, driven by the knowledge that people were waiting for help. When they finally crested the last hill and looked down at Research Outpost 7, they both stopped cold. The outpost was destroyed. Buildings were burned and collapsed. Equipment lay scattered across the ground, and in the middle of the devastation could see bodies. Hissed softly beside him. She said this was not the work of animals. This was an attack. Felt his heart sink. He had come all this way to help, and once again he might be too late. Then he saw movement near one of the collapsed structures. Someone was alive down there. He started running toward the outpost, ignoring's warning cry. If there were survivors, he would find them. He would not fail again. The basement of the main research building was dark and crowded. 7 survivors huddled together in the small space, their faces pale with fear and exhaustion. Counted them twice to make sure, then began examining each one for injuries. There was the outpost director, a thin man with gray hair and a wound on his forehead that had stopped bleeding. There was his assistant, a young woman named Grace who was unhurt but shaking badly. There were two researchers named Daniel Park and Victor Santos, both with minor cuts and bruises. There was a maintenance worker named Bell who had a broken arm that needed setting. And there were two security guards, Caroline Nash and her partner Hayes, both of whom had been shot during the attack. Caroline's wound was the worst. The bullet had passed through her side and damaged something inside. She needed surgery that could not provide in a basement with limited supplies. The best he could do was stop the bleeding and hope she stayed stable long enough to reach Haven's Edge. While Worked told them what had happened. Raiders had attacked 2 days ago without warning. They came in fast ships and hit the outpost before anyone could respond. The security team had tried to fight back but was overwhelmed within minutes. The raiders had killed most of the staff and taken everything valuable they could find. Then they had set fire to the buildings and left, or at least had thought they left. His people had been hiding in the basement ever since, too afraid to come out. Asked what the raiders had been looking for. Hesitated, then said the outpost had made a discovery 2 weeks ago. They had found ruins in the wilderness, ancient structures left by a species that had lived on Six long before either humans or arrived. Inside those ruins, they had found artifacts, devices that still functioned after thousands of years. The raiders must have heard about the discovery somehow. Made an angry sound. She said that word traveled fast on the frontier, especially when credits were involved. Someone at the outpost must have talked to the wrong people. Lowered his eyes and said nothing. His silence was answer enough. Finished treating Caroline and moved to Set's broken arm. As he worked, he found himself thinking about the attack pattern had described. Fast and overwhelming with superior numbers and no warning. It sounded familiar. It sounded like Kestrel 4. The memory hit him like a physical blow. He stopped moving, his hands frozen in place as images flooded his mind. The canyon, the screaming, the blood, his friends dying while he watched helplessly. Noticed his stillness and moved to his side. She asked if he was hurt. Forced himself to breathe. He said he was fine, just remembering something he would rather forget. Then he continued working on his arm, pushing the memories back into the dark corner where they lived. When everyone had been treated, gathered the survivors together and explained their situation. They were 3 days from Haven's Edge with 7 people, 2 of whom were seriously wounded. The raiders might still be in the area, looking for the artifacts they had not found. Moving would be dangerous, but staying was worse. They would leave at nightfall and travel through the darkness when the raiders would have difficulty tracking them, would lead the way and scout ahead for danger, would stay with the group and keep the wounded stable. It was not a good plan, but it was the only one they had. Asked about the artifacts, he said some of them were still hidden in a secondary cache near the ruins. Should they try to recover them? Said no without hesitation. Lives mattered more than artifacts. Whatever ancient technology lay hidden in those ruins could wait. Getting these people home safely was the only priority. Agreed, which seemed to surprise some of the survivors. They had heard stories about greed and had expected her to push for the valuable find, but just shook her head and said she had seen enough death over worthless things. The artifacts were not worth more lives. They spent the remaining daylight hours preparing for the journey, distributed the medical supplies among several packs so no single loss would leave them without resources, scouted the immediate area and found signs that the raiders had moved north, away from the path back to Haven's Edge. It was good news, but not a guarantee of safety. As the sun began to set, found himself standing alone near the burned remains of the outpost's main building. He stared at the destruction and thought about the people who had died here, people he had never met and could never save. Appeared beside him without sound, as she often did. She asked what he was thinking. Said he was thinking about failure. He said he had come here to help, but most of the people at this outpost were already dead. Once again, he had arrived too late. Was quiet for a moment, then she said something that surprised him. She said he had not failed. She said 7 people were alive because he had come. 7 people who would have died in that basement if no help had arrived. She said he could not save everyone, and blaming himself for the dead was foolish when there were living people who still needed him. Turned to look at her. Her face was serious, her yellow eyes steady. She said she had spent 3 years blaming herself for the deaths of her pride. 3 years believing she should have died with them. But watching him push through his own pain to help others, had made her realize something. She said surviving was not a curse. Surviving was an opportunity to help the living, to protect those who still remained. The dead were gone and could not be helped, but the living needed people like them, people who understood the cost of survival and were willing to bear it. Felt something shift inside him, a wall he had built starting to crack. He said he wanted to believe her, but it was hard. The guilt was always there, whispering that he did not deserve to live. Nodded slowly. She said she knew that whisper well. It had been her constant companion since the death of her pride, but lately it had grown quieter. Since seeing that she was not alone in her brokenness, the whisper had started to fade. She said perhaps that was why broken people needed each other. Not to fix each other, but to remind each other that survival was not shameful. That continuing to live, continuing to help, was the only way to honor those who did not make it. Did not know what to say. No one had ever put his feelings into words so precisely. He had thought he was alone in his guilt, unique in his suffering, but understood. She felt the same things he felt, and somehow that shared understanding made the weight a little easier to bear. The sun disappeared below the horizon, and darkness settled over the ruined outpost. Took a deep breath and turned toward the basement where the survivors waited. He said it was time to go. He said they had a long journey ahead and people counting on them. Walked beside him, and for the first time since Kestrel 4, did not feel completely alone. They gathered the survivors and began the long march home. Caroline had to be carried on a stretcher made from salvaged materials, walked with his broken arm supported in a sling. The others moved under their own power, tired and scared but still moving. Stayed in the middle of the group, watching for signs of trouble and checking on the wounded every few hours. Ranged ahead, her night vision and hunting instincts making her perfect for scouting the path. They traveled through the darkness, 7 survivors and 2 broken souls, all hopping to reach safety before their luck ran out. By morning they had covered good ground, allowed a brief rest while he checked Caroline's wound. It was holding, but she was weak from blood loss. She needed proper medical facilities soon. He was rewrapping her bandages when appeared suddenly at his side. Her ears were flat, and her tail was puffed with alarm. She said they had a problem. She said she had found tracks less than an hour old. The raiders had not left the area after all. They were being hunted. Looked at the exhausted faces of the survivors and made a decision. They could not outrun the raiders, not with wounded people slowing them down. They needed to be smart instead of fast. He asked how many raiders were tracking them. She said she had counted at least 8, maybe more. They were moving in a wide pattern, searching methodically. They would find the group within a few hours if nothing changed. Turned to the survivors and asked if anyone had combat experience. Raised his hand despite his wounded shoulder. So did Caroline from her stretcher, though shook his head at her. She was in no condition to fight. 3 against 8 or more. Those were bad odds, but had learned on Kestrel 4 that numbers did not always decide battles. Terrain and tactics could even the score. He asked about the land ahead. Was there anywhere they could use to their advantage? Thought for a moment, then said there was a river crossing about 2 hours ahead. The water was deep and fast there, with only one bridge. If they could reach it first and set up a defense, they could hold the raiders at the while the survivors crossed. It was risky. Everything about their situation was risky, but it was better than running blindly until the raiders caught them in the open. They moved faster now, pushing the pace as much as the wounded could handle, helped carry Caroline's stretcher, ignoring the burn in his arms and shoulders. Every minute counted. They reached the river as the sun climbed toward its peak. The water roared below them, white foam churning over rocks. The bridge was old but sturdy, a structure of metal and stone that had probably been built by the first settlers. Helped the survivors across one by one. Went first with Grace, then Victor and Daniel, then with his broken arm. Stayed behind with his good hand gripping a weapon taken from the ruined outpost. Caroline was the last to cross. She was barely conscious now, her face pale and her breathing shallow. Checked her wound one final time before they lifted her stretcher. The bleeding had started again. He told to keep moving once they reached the other side. Do not stop until you reach Haven's edge. The settlement would send help once they knew what had happened. Asked what was going to do. Said he was going to buy them time. He said the raiders would not cross this bridge easily. Hesitated, clearly wanting to argue, but Grace pulled him away. They crossed the bridge and kept moving, disappearing into the wilderness on the other side. Turned to face the direction they had come. Beside him, drew her hunting blade and checked his weapon. They did not have to wait long. The raiders emerged from the tree line in a loose formation. Counted 10 of them, a mix of humans and other species he did not recognize. They were armed with projectile weapons and blades, and they moved with the confidence of people who expected easy prey. Their leader was a large human with a face and cold eyes. He stopped at the edge of the clearing and looked at the 3 defenders blocking the bridge. He said they were making a mistake. He said all they wanted was the artifacts, and if the research team handed them over, no one else had to die. Said the artifacts were not here. He said they had left them at the outpost. If the raiders wanted them, they could go back and dig through the ruins. The leader's face darkened. He knew was lying, or at least suspected it. He raised his hand and signaled his people forward. The first wave came fast, 3 raiders rushing the bridge while the others provided cover fire. Ducked behind a stone pillar and let in handle the close combat. Dropped 1 raider with a precise shot. Killed another with her blade before he could reach the bridge. The 3rd raider got through and swung at with a heavy club. Dodged and struck back with his knife, catching the man in the arm. The raider screamed and stumbled, kicked him off the bridge and watched him fall into the churning water below. The second wave was more cautious. The raiders spread out and tried to flank them, but the river was too wide and fast to cross anywhere except the bridge. They were forced to funnel through just as had planned. The fighting went on for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Lost track of how many raiders fell. His world narrowed to the immediate moment, the next attack, the next threat. His training took over and he fought without thinking, without remembering. Then cried out. Spun and saw her fall, a deep wound on her side from a blade that had slipped past her guard. A raider stood over her, raising his weapon for a killing blow. Did not think. He threw himself at the raider and tackled him away from. They rolled across the bridge, trading blows, until managed to get his knife into the man's chest. He scrambled back to and pressed his hands against her wound. The cut was deep, bleeding heavily. She would die if he did not stop it. Appeared beside him, firing at the remaining raiders who were pulling back to regroup. He said they had hurt the enemy badly, but more would come. They needed to move. Said could not move. He said she would bleed out if he took his hands away. Grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. Her yellow eyes were bright with pain but also something else, determination. She said he had to go. She said the survivors needed him more than she did. She said she had lived longer than she deserved already. Shook his head. He said he was not leaving her. He said he had lost enough people and he refused to lose one more. He would carry her if he had to. Made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. She said humans were stubborn creatures. She said she had never understood why they fought so hard for people they barely knew. Said it was because people mattered, all people, human, it did not make a difference. Every life was worth saving. Every person deserved someone who would fight for them. He pressed harder on her wound, willing the bleeding to stop. His hands shook badly, worse than they ever had before, but they did not falter. Then he heard it, a sound in the distance growing louder, engines. He looked up and saw vehicles approaching from the direction of Haven's Edge. Settlement security, armed and ready. Someone must have picked up their distress beacon. The raiders saw them too. Their leader shouted a retreat, and the survivors of his band fled into the wilderness, disappearing as quickly as they had come. The security team reached the bridge within minutes, recognized Lisa among them, the settlement administrator that had mentioned weeks ago. Lisa took one look at the situation and started issuing orders. Medics rushed to side and took over from. He let them, his hands finally going still as the urgency passed. Someone wrapped a blanket around his shoulders and tried to lead him away, but he refused to move. He stayed beside until the medics stabilized her wound and loaded her onto a transport. Then he climbed in beside her and held her clawed hand as they flew back to Haven's Edge. 2 weeks later, stood outside the clinic and watched the sun set over the frontier settlement. His wounds had healed, leaving scars that would fade with time. His wounds were healing too, slower than his but steady. She would survive. She came to stand beside him now, moving carefully to protect her still tender side. They watched the sky turn orange and purple together. Said she had been thinking about what he had said on the bridge, about every life being worth saving. She said she had never believed that before. Her people taught that strength mattered above all, that the weak deserved their fate, but had shown her a different way. Said he was still learning that lesson himself. He said he had come to Six to disappear, to run from his past until he stopped existing. But somewhere along the way, he had found a reason to stay. Asked what reason that was. Looked at her face and her yellow eyes that no longer seemed empty. He said he had found someone who understood him, someone who carried the same weight he carried, someone worth staying for. Was silent for a long moment. Then she did something had never seen her do. She leaned against him, pressing her shoulder to his in a gesture of connection and trust. She said she had found the same thing. She said she had spent 3 years alone, believing she deserved her isolation, but had shown her that survival was not a punishment. It was a gift, and gifts were meant to be shared. They stood together as darkness settled over Haven's Edge. Behind them, a transport ship landed at the settlement port, carrying new arrivals from distant worlds, people running from their pasts, seeking new beginnings on the frontier. And turned to watch them disembark. 2 broken souls who had found each other in the wilderness. 2 survivors who had learned that the best way to honor the dead was to help the living. Tomorrow there would be more work to do, more patients to treat, more travelers to guide, more lives to save. The frontier was harsh and dangerous, and it needed people who understood what it meant to lose everything and keep going anyway. Reached down and took his clawed hand in his own. She did not pull away. They walked toward the landing port together, ready to welcome the next group of refugees, the next collection of broken people seeking a place to heal. The past would always be with them. The guilt, the loss, the memories of those they could not save. But the future lay ahead, bright and uncertain, full of possibilities they had almost given up on. They were not fixed. They were not whole, but they were no longer alone. And sometimes that was enough.